there's been some news this week. It's this brand called Gallet, and honestly, like, do you guys know what Gallet is? And if Breitling does acquire this brand, is it set to be Breitling's Tudor? But fortunately, I've got our UK editor, Russell Sheldrake, with me, and I also have Tony Traina, who was one of two people to break the story to the world. So Tony, welcome to the channel. Let everybody know what you've got going on right now, what you're doing.
Zach, Russell, thanks so much for having me. Some folks might know me from Hodinkee. I was an editor there for a couple of years, but before that I had my own little newsletter, and I've kind of jumped back into doing that again on a more regular basis. It's called Unpolished, unpolishedwatches.com, or if you just find me on Instagram, you can probably find it from there as well. So happy to be on the Time+Tide show here.
Yeah, and for anybody who wants to check out Tony's really great newsletter, we'll put a link in the description as well. So yeah, look, we're here today because you broke this news about Gallet and Breitling. But as I've mentioned, like, look, I'm a watch journalist and I'm supposed to know everything, or people think that we're supposed to know everything. Gallet is not this kind of, super well-known brand that I could just rattle off every little fact and nook and cranny about the brand. But Russell, what can you tell us about Gallet? Let's get everybody up to speed.
What can I tell you about Gallet, Zach? Well, look, it's a bit of a collector favorite brand. It's been it sort of knocks around Chrono 24 pretty regularly, with plenty of sort of editions out there to find. There's plenty of iterations of their well-known chronographs. But what some people don't know is that Gallet have a claim to being the oldest watch brand in the world. Okay. So they were they claim that they were founded in 1466 in Geneva, which I think beats out most of the currently operating brands anyway. But that's kind of a vague date, and they certainly weren't making any wristwatches back then. But then they sort of get really formalized in 1826 when Gallet and Co. is officially kind of put the name on the letterhead, as it were.
Okay, and just to be clear, Gallet is a Swiss brand.
Absolutely Swiss brand. Now, there were some Gallet family members living in France between 1466 and the 1800s, but then they moved to Geneva, I believe, because they were Protestants, and so they joined the family members in Geneva that were already there.
Okay.
And so, yeah, they are
so
very
with Gallet, it's my understanding that what they're predominantly known for is like sort of wartime era chronographs, right? So
exactly.
We're talking about like the 30s-ish.
Yeah, that was really their heyday. But there's actually one moment in their history that I want to draw you to pre that, which was they made the stopwatches that were used by the Wright brothers in their first flight.
Oh.
So they had their chronograph, or stopwatches, they weren't chronographs, they were just stopwatches. There was one in the plane and then one on the ground. And one of those watches, the one that was in the plane, actually the crystal is still cracked from when the plane flipped over on one of their flights. And I believe that one's in the Smithsonian right now, so you can go and see it. And then the second one, I believe, is owned by the brand. So it could be appearing in a Breitling museum one day soon. You never know. But going back to the heyday, 1930s, absolutely. That was what Gallet are known for now by collectors, is their sort of late 30s, early 40s and 60s chronographs. Now, a lot of people will be familiar with the multi-chrono series. The M30, M12s are sort of really popular. And here is where you get that massive variation. You get pulsation dials, you get regulator dials, you get all sorts out there. And they're pretty available and sort of fairly affordable as well. You can pick them up for anywhere between sort of 1,500, and then really nice examples can go up to sort of 5,000-6,000 at the moment. But you've got to imagine when this, or if this purchase is announced, those prices will start to increase.
Yeah, well, look, we're certainly going to touch on pricing later, but we've sort of established the region that the brand is in and sort of some staple models. So it's clear that there's heritage and history, right, for whoever were to acquire this brand to sort of play with. But one thing I just want to also establish as we're talking history is, historically speaking, like, this is a brand that was working in like what I like to call the specialist era, right? Where people were using specialists to, use certain cases or dials, or in particular, what I'm about to ask is movement. So am I correct in saying that largely when we're talking, let's say, Gallet chronographs, we're talking like Valjoux movements or Minerva movements?
Yeah, I've seen plenty with Valjoux. I haven't seen that many with Minerva. Tony, I don't know if you've dug into these at all.
They use a lot of Excelsior Park movements in the
Excelsior
40s
Park,
and 50s
okay.
especially. Yeah.
Again, I raise that as well because when we dig a bit further, these sort of older calibers that really aren't made anymore, it's an important thing to think about when you're talking about reviving a brand. But speaking of reviving a brand, Tony, this is the story that you were at least one of two people to really first break it to the world. So what is the story? Like, what's going on? Why should we care?
Yeah, it's funny. I first heard rumor that Gallet had been acquired by Breitling back in late summer of 2024, and the whispers became shouts basically in the last month or two. And it sounds like, according to Miss Tweed, that they may be kind of unveiling the acquisition and the plans for the brand here as soon as March, which is something I'd not heard yet, which is exciting. But Gallet, like so many of these Swiss watch brands, fell on hard times after the quartz crisis through the 90s and fell into American ownership. And Russell alluded to the history of the brand, and from what I understand, some of it's a bit dubious. Like that 1466 date is a little bit dubious, and it really dates to 1826, I think. And I think what I've heard is that Breitling will be kind of deliberate as it tells the story of the brand in being very clear about what's actually true and established about the brand and what's not. But it sounds like Breitling has acquired the rights to Gallet watch from this previous American ownership that's held it for quite some time. And their plan is to kind of do a slow rollout of it over the next few months, or few years, I should say, much what we've seen with Universal Genéve. They announced that acquisition in late 2023, December of 2023, and rumors are that the first production pull router is not going to come out until the first quarter of 2026 if all goes according to plan. So that's quite a slow and deliberate pace, which is nice to see that they're sort of being thoughtful about the movement, manufacturing, production process, branding, everything else. I imagine it would be much the same as Gallet, but from a product and brand group standpoint, because that's what it is now with Breitling and the ownership and private money behind them. They've got Gallet, which they plan to position at the lower end, Breitling, where it is now kind of in the middle, and then, as we've heard George Kern, the CEO of Breitling, talk about, Universal Genéve at the high end, and it kind of remains to be seen what that means and what that could mean for Gallet as well. Is low end $1,000? Is it Tudor, like you're saying, $3,000 to $6,000 maybe? I think a lot of details are still to be worked out, but these are kind of the details that we have now, at least.
No, it's excellent that you've said that, because that really was my first thought when I saw this news. Is when you look at Gallet and Breitling, these are two brands that are, they have strong tool watch ties, but Breitling is a brand that's really been in continuous sort of production and has, like many brands that we're seeing, including Rolex, you start to see this level of tool watch brand elevating into the status of luxury brand and going up and up and up in pricing. So if you have two brands, when Breitling acquired Universal Genéve, I understood the vision because you're diversifying the portfolio, and you're while yes, UG makes chronographs, the pole router is certainly a design that Breitling does not really offer. So you have a nice foil there. But then when I see Gallet, I'm like, well, these are two people that are kind of in the same lane. So how is this going to work? And the only thing that I could think of is that as Breitling moves up market, Gallet steps in to, provide a more price approachable. I hesitate to say affordable, because we know the danger of saying that, but price approachable.
It's the entry level that they're going.
Yeah, the entry level.
Yeah. Accessible is the word I've been using lately. I don't know how you guys feel about that one.
And that, of course, is the genesis of Tudor as sort of, the shield that was protecting Rolex and making watches that if you couldn't afford a Rolex, you could buy a Tudor, which once upon a time was just a Rolex case merged with an ETA movement. And so is that what we're basically going to see with Gallet? With UG, correct me if I'm wrong here, Tony, but they said that it's going to be manufactured independent from Breitling, or is it just being managed?
It's not completely clear to me, actually. It'll be interesting to see, right, what happens and what the shared, to use a business term, synergies are and what they are not, what's different and what's the same both inside and outside of the watch as far as marketing and retailing and all of that. I don't think it's totally clear at this point, even for Universal Genéve, and that's, let's say, 12 to 15 months away. So anything that we know about Gallet, or anything that we would say about Gallet, would be pure speculation at this point.
Of course.
But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where they decide that there are efficiencies to be gained in the production process, and then where the brands will stand on their own in terms of manufacturing, craftsmanship, everything else.
Because when it comes to pricing, and this is why I mentioned the whole Valjoux and Minerva and all of that, the second you wade into the territory of either reviving an old movement or using new old stock calibers, a watch becomes much more expensive. Whereas if you're trying to play in that sort of, let's say, Tudor price point, then odds are, I mean, I would imagine there's a world in which it's like at a 2894s or 7750s or whatever. But then again, you use calibers like that, and then are you going to get the dimensions that people want? I mean, that was the thing with the pole router, right? Everybody's like, we don't want to see a 42 millimeter pole router. So this is all like important stuff that we don't have the answers to yet. But yeah.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, Gallet is known especially amongst American watch collectors. I think it was rather popular in the United States. You just don't see a lot of Gallet watches unearthed in Europe or the UK. It was a very American brand in many respects. And I think back to the relaunch of Tudor on the American market in modern times, because it started obviously with ETA movements, but in the past 5 years especially, we've seen them transition into more of the in-house, or at least Kinesi movements that are, Tudor IP or Tudor exclusive IP in many cases. So I have no idea if that provides any roadmap for what Gallet might do, or if they'll leverage Sellita movements entirely, if they'll leverage, like, are there efficiencies to be gained in just leveraging what Breitling's already got built out? I have no idea, but it'll be interesting to see how a brand thinks about going, or how it thinks about building a accessible brand as the foil to its already more luxury products in 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well. Like, we're seeing now, it seems to me, this kind of like new era of group building in the industry, where we obviously saw Swatch and Richemont and LVMH sort of spring up around the similar times, sort of LVMH a little later. We're now seeing, I kind of categorize Louis Vuitton as having a group with Daniel Roth and Gerald Genter underneath their banner
The
of
La
sort of,
Fabrique group. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And then I also find really interesting the Chanel group that we see now with the independents that they've invested in, while they're not controlled or they don't have controlling stakes. They've given money to, and they're sort of helping develop those brands. But it seems like Breitling now are making a move to develop their own small group, even if it's sort of taking a little bit longer and moving in slightly a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, establishing a Kerniverse, let's say, there's potential there. And as Tony said before as well, I appreciate that there's not this sort of rush to just get everything sort of out in like 2025. Like, take your time, do it right, because as we've seen with these brands, like, they went out of business for a reason, right? So like, you only get one first impression. Like, make that first impression as strong as it can be when you actually revive it. With Breitling, it's a bit tricky, circling back to the movement side of things, because with Rolex and Tudor, Rolex has its own movements, and Tudor with Kinesi has its own manufactured calibers. But for Breitling and Gallet, it's not like a Gallet can use, a B01, because then it's using the exact same movement as a Breitling. And two, if it's using that movement, then the sizes, again, aren't going to be vintage adjacent. I mean, that's been something that for some collectors has plagued the Breitling catalog, in terms of like the diameters typically skew larger and the watch is a little bit thicker. And I imagine people with Gallet would prefer that doesn't happen. Now, that's the beauty of Sellita and Edda and all that, is typically watches can be thinner. So there's a roadmap there, but...
This is a question that I actually want to pose to both of you here. Do you think that if this is going to happen and Breitling do purchase Gallet and the announcement's made, do Breitling and the new Gallet, do they need to stay true to the vintage aesthetics? Or do you think that the Gallet brand has been essentially defunct now for long enough that it could do with a reinvention and they could completely modernize it, but just using the Gallet name?
We've had so many heritage reissues in the past 15 years. I'm not sure that that's what the world wants. Tudor and Longines, I think we're kind of at the forefront of that, but that's been 15, 18 years ago at this point. Legend divers and black bays that we've been talking about, stuff like that. I don't know if that's what people want. At the same time, we're seeing it more with micro brands now, but we don't see a lot of these vintage, heritage inspired, in terms of size at least, on the chronograph side of things. And I think a lot of the Gallet play will be accessibly priced chronographs, which does put you in competition with a lot of the micro brands that have flourished in the past few years, because I think they've been taking the opportunity that a lot of these heritage brands have not, by using well-sized Sellita movements and whatever else to put them in cases that nerds like us kind of like or want to see. So it'll be interesting to see if that's the space that Gallet plays in. But I just hope aesthetically they don't lean too into the flying officer, that Harry Truman wore aesthetic. I hope they tweak it or modernize it a little bit to make it feel like a watch that is made in 2025, 2026. And even if it's little mechanical innovations as well, working closer in partnership with Sellita or Soprod or whoever else they decide to use if they do go third party, to make it more than just a chronograph, even if it's just a flyback or other subtle tweaks that show we're pushing the world forward.
Yeah, to be honest, I suspect, if I was a betting man, that this is going to be very heritage driven. I mean, that's kind of the Kern Breitling MO. Like, we've seen this whole overhaul in terms of making the Premier and Dato, like all these watches are being inspired from the 40s, and we know, shout out to Fred, who's really been an instrumental part of that process in terms of tying modern Breitling closer and better to vintage Breitling. And the first thing we see out of UG is effectively a recreation of the pole router that was largely very faithful. So I suspect that that's probably the aim and mission for Gallet. But I would argue, establish it with the heritage collection at launch, and then the question becomes, how far can you take it once that heritage baseline is set? Like, if all of a sudden you as Longines has done, you do a twist on a Longines Avigation Big Eye with like a petrol blue dial and a titanium case, but that can't be the first thing that comes out of Gallet. I don't think that would work. But on the subject of like what would work, what wouldn't work, let's all just sort of to round this out here. What do we want to see from the brand? Where do we think it should be priced? Like, given it an exact number, and anything else that you think has to happen for this to be successful.
Tony, I'll let you go.
I think the Flying Officer is perhaps the most well-known Gallet, or most collectible Gallet for people that are into it. Harry Truman famously wore it when he was president, and I would bet that, much the way they're leveraging the pole router as the way to launch the brand, that'll probably be the first one. For those who don't know, it's a chronograph, 2-register chronograph watch with a cool sort of world time bezel or outer ring. So it is a little bit different than what you see from most brands right now. So that'd be a cool thing that, it's heritage inspired, but it's something that you don't really see aesthetically from other brands right now. So I bet that's where they go first. And then I think they'll rely heavily on, Russell alluded to or mentioned the multi-chron series. There's so many varieties in that. 2-register, 3-register, yachting versions, all Navigator, GMT style stuff. I bet they lean heavy into that going forward and really try to be the accessible chronograph brand, much the way that Tudor is the accessible dive watch brand.
I think you're pretty spot on. Although one thing that I'd love to see from them is bringing back to the clamshell case that they used to make, and that kind of the innovation that they did. It was like 39, I think they brought it out, and having these sort of like 4 little screws in the underside of the lugs to secure the case in, and have a truly water resistant chronograph back in the late 30s was pretty amazing. And so I think if they could lean on that heritage a little bit, I think would be great. And do something along that line, whether it's a diving chronograph that's super affordable. But I agree with you, Tony. I think it does have to be in the affordable end. There's no way that Breitling can bring this out and price it the same as a B01 chronograph.
Yeah, well, it sounds like there's somebody agreeing with you in the form of a woof. But but no, look, I'm in agreement with what you guys are saying. I think what I would add to it is the path to success is these can't simply be Breitling watches with a different dial and a less expensive movement. I like Universal Genéve. I think that they've got to ensure that these watches are of a certain size, ideally below 40 millimeters. And I think that from a pricing perspective, I would want to see creations from them in the like 35 to 4,500 US for a chronograph sort of window, especially considering, as you raised, Russell, that on the secondary market right now, people can find the originals for 1.5, 2.5. So you can't all of a sudden have this sticker shock where you have like a $6,000-7,000 chronograph that's new that says Gallet on it when you can buy the originals that are more than likely going to be inspiring it. I mean, this is theoretically the problem Universal Genéve might face, because pole routers are not the most expensive watches on the secondary market. And if you deliver it too high, there's got to be a reason for people to make that jump up. So that would be my word of caution, I think, to Kern and Breitling and the whole Kerniverse and group that we've since established.
Yeah, and it's a competitive space, and people kind of say this, like, why would you want to compete in that space, say $3,000 to $5,000 or whatever it is? But at the end of the day, it's probably good for consumers, right? More options is usually a good thing. So I wish them luck in their efforts.
Yeah.
Certainly wish them luck as well. All right. Well, guys, this has been an excellent discussion. Tony, thank you so much for joining us. Again, you can find the link to his Unpolished newsletter in the description. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let us know in the comments what you think Gallet should do if it is revived, what you'd like to see from the brand, or if you have any further questions, we'll all jump into the comments and answer any questions you have. And yeah, as always, we'll see you on the next one.